note, today's session is being recorded. If you have any objections, you can disconnect at this time. Thank you very much. And on behalf of the National Cancer Institute, I wish to welcome everyone to today's Implementation Science webinar. We are excited to be joined by our speakers, but before we get started, a brief word about logistics. We ask that if you are not already on mute, to please keep your phone on mute for the duration of today's presentation. As mentioned, this session is being recorded, and muting all lines will help us to avoid any background noise. We encourage questions. They can be submitted using the Q&A feature on the right-hand side of your screen. Type your questions to the provided Q&A field and hit submit. Feel free to submit your questions at any time during today's call. And with that, I will turn it over to David.
Thank you, Sarah, as always, and thanks to our esteemed guests who you can now see in front of you. Not quite being attacked by a spider, but that spider's hanging out just in case it chooses to move further down the screen as we go along. For those of you who haven't joined us before with this kind of a format, this is really an opportunity to get various experts to talk through issues of importance, experiences of importance to our implementation science community. We have done the fireside or campfire chats. I think this is probably fireside as we're getting a little bit colder outside. Warm inside, but cold outside. This is part of a suite of webinars that are really focusing on grant-related issues. So those of you who joined us last month, it was more of a specific focus on career development. This time, it's really learning from those who have been successful in receiving R21s, R01s, NIH grants overall. And then next month, we'll be delving more specifically into experiences from review. The ways in which the format works is really to try and make sure that over the course of the hour, we not only hear from our experts, but we really hear from all of you as to what are the kinds of things that you would like to know. And of course, since this is about that whole process of developing and then submitting applications, receiving funding, and then managing grants, we'd love to have you drive the conversation about that whole process and what both or all three, Becca and Mega and Ted, can respond to of the questions that you all have. So it's a pleasure to welcome these three esteemed folks. Becca and Ted, I have been able to connect with through the MT-DIRC program, as well as through their sort of graduation, I would say, from being fellows in training courses around dissemination and implementation research to becoming faculty in those courses. And so we've been privileged to have them also in the position of helping others with their concepts and others develop their own work in addition to the fine work that they've been able to develop. Mega, it's been a wonderful thing to see all of the work that she has done over the years, and I remember seeing early emails and phone conversations talking about some of these early concepts that she was developing, and just to see how those have really transformed into wonderful projects in the field, both those that are specifically under the implementation science heading, but also, and this is a nod to our co-sponsor, also in the behavioral research side of things. So this is one webinar that is co-sponsored between our implementation science team and the behavioral research program at the NCI. And so Mega also represents that really nice intersection between some of what we're trying to do on the implementation science side, keeping in mind all of the good work that is being done and needs to be advanced in behavioral research. So welcome to Becca, Mega, and Ted. Thank you all for joining us. And we just wanted to start out in a way that we often do, which is to hear from each of you, and maybe in the order that we can see your smiling faces, Becca, and then Mega, and then Ted, a little bit about how each of you first became interested in implementation science, how you identified this as an area that you'd like to pursue. So Becca, do you want to kick us off?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the nice introduction, David. It's really an honor to be here today. So my journey in implementation science began over a decade ago when I was a research assistant just starting my master's program. And I was working on a project that was with the YMCA of the USA. They were trying to roll out a national program around nutrition and physical activity, and we were evaluating that program. And I was tasked with doing interviews with the site directors that were running these after-school programs that were a part of this really large initiative. And I was able to go to different parts of the country and speak to these folks who are really the implementers, the practitioners on the ground doing the work, and heard a lot about their challenges and successes from their perspective rather than from our research perspective, and started noticing large differences between how the program was rolling out in different parts of the country with different staffing at programs. And I got really interested in these contextual factors that really make or break an intervention. I didn't know what implementation science was at the time, but that framework of trying to understand context and how it impacts prevention programming and the interventions that we design in advocacy trials all the way into what we're doing in practice got me really excited. So that's how it all began for me.
So David, Sarah, thanks for having us, and thank you to the audience members who have tuned in. So I think with my research, I work with women leaving jails, and I largely design, implement, and evaluate sexual health interventions, including for cervical cancer prevention. And it's always been about following a need. So there are a couple of large epidemiological studies that showed that women with criminal justice involvement had 4 to 5 times the cervical cancer risk compared to women in the free community. But there was very little research that investigated why, and so I was sort of, following that research question of why. In the first study, we learned sort of about where women said they were getting screened. Many of them said they were getting screened in an emergency room, which is not possible. So then I started having questions about women's cervical health literacy, and so got a small RO3 to do in-depth interviewing with women, and took those qualitative results and just straight away developed an intervention that addressed women's cervical health literacy. And that, again, was filling a need in terms of, a lack of interventions to address this problem. There's also been sort of a stair-step approach to my research. So you ask one set of questions, you get one set of answers, and then you move on to the next project. And that's really how I've sort of built my research portfolio. There's a grant, the cervical cancer prevention grant that's available for download and for viewing. And that project, it was effective. We improved women's cervical cancer screening, but we also learned that women don't want to just know about one health condition, that they sort of think about women's health more broadly. So in the competing renewal to that project, we address multiple women's health conditions, STIs, unintended pregnancy, breast cancer, cervical cancer, and we also are testing new modalities for intervention. So I also have this belief that you never want to let an intervention die. The NIH invests millions of dollars in these interventions. Investigators invest so much time in the community. And so if you have an intervention, whether it works or doesn't, there's always something to be learned. And I think the implementation science lesson there is, well, what do you do next? And that's really sort of the burden of the researcher to figure out.
Great. Thanks. Ted?
Thank you. So I came to implementation science and implementation research by way of health services research. So I did my clinical training, and then I came to University of Michigan for a health services research fellowship and an oncology fellowship. And I became fairly skilled and was in an environment that was really robust with health services researchers and big data analytics and biostatistical support to really look at variation in quality of care and healthcare delivery in terms of cost, quality, and access. So at the end of my period, my fellowship, I began looking for, okay, well, how was I going to develop my career? And I had looked at variation in care for a few years and had studied it quite a bit, but I wanted to understand more about the context and why there's variability in the care of prostate cancer survivors, why or how is there variability in readmissions after bladder cancer. So really looking within my disease area and wanting to understand more about why there was variation and how could we take evidence-based practice and get it into rich clinical contexts. And so became fascinated with that conceptually. Fortunately, I was able to meet with Ann Sales, who became my mentor for my Career Development Award, and really learn, like Becca said, I didn't really know what implementation science was, so I started asking a lot of folks, and there's other folks here in Ann Arbor that I met with, and basically became fascinated by the transdisciplinary nature of implementation science and the richness of all the different intersecting fields that kind of point to healthcare delivery. So that was my kind of story, how I came to implementation research.
Great. You'll see the pictures have changed, and so we have our lovely taste foreshadowing what will likely befall many kids in our midst tomorrow.
Well, they're in conversation, and to jump in very quickly, for those who are following along on the web meeting, in the chat function, you'll see links pop up. So right now, all 3 of those full text grants are available in the event that you wanted to download those quickly. And as folks talk about things, I'll be updating the chat section. So do keep an eye on that if you so choose.
Yes, thank you very much for that, Sarah. And yeah, again, for people who have not taken a look, one of the more highly trafficked areas of our website is the listing of the opportunity to take a look at various full grants, and all 3 of our guests have been willing to contribute those both to implementation science and to the behavioral research programs set of those studies. So moving on, each of you got to that point where you felt like you were ready to submit a research project grant, and each of you have had a different experience with multiple grants. But for those that are, I guess, both related to BRP and implementation science, I wonder if each of you could talk a little bit about how you got to that point where you felt like you were ready to submit that grant, and how the process that you undertook to develop the key aims for the study. Megan, maybe we can start with you and then move to Ted and Becca.
Sure. So I think the first step is really just, like I said, following a need, but thinking through what is sort of the most important research question. And I usually do that best at 4 o'clock with a glass of wine. So I think through this great idea, and I try over the period of a few days to really just write a full draft of aims. And one of the first people I usually go to for feedback is my program officer. So, based on the announcement, I'll find the appropriate program officer, I'll get feedback. Does this fit within the mission? Is this something that's interesting? I always incorporate feedback. And I usually spend about a month writing about 12 versions of the specific aims page. And I always try to get that super tight. Once I have a tight aims page after that month, then I try to go away, usually on vacation, on working vacation, and I try to write the full proposal in about 1 sitting. So I usually take about 2 weeks to write a full proposal. And the reason I cram it into such a short period of time is if you do it without doing anything else, you're able to pull together a lot of ideas, cross all the T's, dot all the I's, make sure every single aim tracks to each variable, to each method. And then I spend another month or so getting feedback. I pay people for feedback. I get feedback from colleagues. I get feedback, of course, from my collaborators. And so I usually work on about a 4-month timeline for myself to get grants ready for submission. But it's that concentrated period of writing is really crucial for me.
Gotcha.
So for me, I was in, as part of my VA Career Development Award that I received, part of that training involved the MT Dirk program, where I met you, David, and the host of other faculty, and really became immersed in that 2-year program with distance mentoring and local mentoring. And as I was working through my aims, which were basically quantitative evaluation of variation in care, and then qualitative interviews with providers, I became kind of more facile with a mixed methods approach to informing implementation strategies and tailoring. So it was in the midst of my Career Development Award where I was working through the aims, and I met with my team and really talked to them about something that I was learning from providers that had been a longstanding clinical dilemma for me with respect to the chemical castration or overuse hormone therapy for men with prostate cancer. And this was the time when there was increasing interest in de-implementation and choosing wisely. So I really used that growth period during the Career Development Award to continue working on that, but to have a more dovetail a stream of research that was relevant to career development and really work within my team, and then use the emerging interest in implementation research to get folks from the School of Marketing and qualitative folks and some mixed methods folks to really help me hone down what that project would look like. I, would go through a lot of set of aims with my mentor and then pitch it to the team over, weeks and months and continue to get feedback, similar to Mega and eventually, was able to submit it. So I think the mentorship was very important, and then, making sure that the problem was significant and that the approach that we were looking at would be considered somewhat innovative and potentially fill a generalizable knowledge gap in the field.
Great. Becca, you want to share your experience?
Sure. It builds a lot on what was already said. I think it's important first to kind of think about the context where I was at. So I had recently graduated from my doctoral program doing implementation science as part of my dissertation. So doing implementation science pretty early in my career, and like Ted, was in the MT-DIRC program, and I think that was the foundation, is having that program to really guide me along very early in my career was very essential to getting me on the right track for making me feel like I was ready for that next step. And I think where our program of research as a center was made a really big difference. I had talked about before our work with the YMCA. Then in the interim, we'd done a randomized trial of an effectiveness study. We found solid results. So we were kind of at a place within our research team to really think about what scale up might look like. And so the research question that was important to our team was really in line with implementation science, and I was the one most excited about that on our team and had just gotten into this training program. So the timing was very ideal for me. And then the other thing that I wanted to kind of jump on Ted's point is I thought a lot and listened really carefully at the D&I meetings for probably the 3 meetings before I submitted, those December meetings where really people are talking about the biggest challenges in the field, and tried to align the needs of our team, our hope for scale up of this intervention, to what experts thought were the most pressing gaps in the field. And I thought long and hard about that implementation or dissemination gap that aligned well with what we wanted to be doing next. So that, along with mentorship from Karen Emmons, who I'd worked with in my in my graduate work, and Graham Colditz, who was my assigned mentor in MT-DIRC, I felt like I had the people beside me to help me kind of move it along.
Great. Thanks to all of you for that. And just want to make a reminder to folks, that we'd love to see any questions that you have as you go on show up in our Q&A box so that we can attend to those. But in the meantime, I think each of you at different points have suggested that implementation science is a team sport. You've talked about sharing aims in the development process, with a team of investigators. And I wonder if we could hear from each of you, and maybe we'll start with Ted and then Becca and Mega. If you could tell us a little bit about how you came up with the team of investigators that you felt like you needed to be on the grant, and how you got them signed on to play specific roles as you were figuring out how best to conduct the work that you were proposing.
For me, it was in part an extension of my career development award team, where now my mentor had become a collaborator after, several years of working together. So, and then my clinical content mentor shifted into a collaborator for the clinical content expertise. I think because of the content and the intrigue from folks who are in other disciplines, like one of my collaborators in the School of Marketing or School of Business and Marketing, I was able to put it in such a way that and ask them about choice experiments and how they use those tools and approaches in science, and how could we apply that approach to healthcare delivery in terms of, thinking about provider behavior change and prioritizing barriers or strategies. So that's, I think that folks outside of medicine or, might be intrigued when you start to talk about implementation research and the impact for, the potential impact for actual clinical care delivery. So I think that is a draw sometimes for folks who might be, wanting some opportunity to directly impact the delivery system.
Great. Becca?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, this research really built on a randomized trial that happened here in Boston. And so I was lucky that we really had the same core investigator team that worked on the effectiveness study as worked on this new implementation science study that was looking at scale up of the intervention. So it was really keeping those investigators engaged at the same level that they were before, but maybe in a different role. So the PI of that grant, who was my mentor, taking more of a backseat expert on the intervention, but not expert on implementation science. So it was thinking about our shifting roles of our existing team. So it's a little bit different. And then I did also want to mention that the investigator team matters a lot, but for this project, it really hinged on having a strong collaboration with, again, the YMCA was our collaborating partner, and kind of ties to the community engaged approach I try to take with a lot of my work. So not going to this organization cold, but actually building on a very long-term relationship with them, because they were going to be key to us in terms of recruitment of our sites, in terms of making sure our asks were really clear and figuring out compensation. So really having that partner on board. And again, the alignment piece was really important. So aligning what we wanted to do in our grant with what their training and capacity building goals as a giant national organization was really key to get them signed on at such a large level.
Great. Megha, you want to share your experience in developing your team?
Yeah, so I think as Ted said, my mentors have always been a part of my team, especially when I was more junior. So I've had, I think, probably 3 types of collaborators. The first is a senior investigator with a name. So especially when I was junior, it was always helpful to have someone who had an established track record with NIH or someone who had an established line of research in my area of study. And that's always proven successful. Secondly, and more importantly, having a senior collaborator who's actually with you in the trenches. So this is a person who's really, really helping, someone who's helping you wrestle with AIM, someone who's helping you brainstorm and troubleshoot in the field, just someone who's very hands-on, who will tell you the truth. I love a collaborator who uses a heavy red pen, or in this case, track changes. And then, of course, the third type of collaborator is just someone who has the methodological expertise to make the project happen, whether that's a statistician or someone with mixed methods expertise. Those 3 types of people really rounded out the team. I will say that my reviewers have tended to have a bias towards having clinical help. So I have a PhD. I'm not a clinician. And so I've learned in the last, 5 to 7 years to always have some sort of clinical expert, like an OB, because that's relevant to my work in cervical cancer research. So I always have either a clinical consultant or a clinical investigator. And I would say both as a reviewer and an investigator, I think less is more. A really clean team where everybody who's on the team makes sense is always really impressive to me, both as a reviewer and just in practice. It's easier to execute a project with a lean team.
Great. So just want to, we have an update of our visual accompaniment. There is a lovely fireplace if you are tuning in and can see it. And it's perfect timing to be able to introduce our first question that was provided. And I think this is specifically for Ted. And so it's somebody who's specifically focusing on Career Development Award application and wanting to know a little bit about the third aim is what I see here, the third aim for your Career Development Award, and how you realized it and how it may have specifically led you to projects or grants following the completion of the Career Development Award. So maybe, Ted, you want to comment on that?
Sure. So I think I was in an environment where the Career Development Awards or the Ks, and I think this is still a common approach where you have some, evidence, three-aimed CDA, which was mine, which was, looking at variation in care and then doing, purposive sampling and doing some qualitative work to understand the variability and context and kind of start to put together a conceptual framework and model for, developing implementation strategies or targeted evidence-based interventions or innovations to address those gaps. So, and I'd be interested in, other folks talking about the kind of 1, 2, 3 aims that basically have been working for a decade or so now, at least as far as I'm aware. Actually getting to do the pilot work that I had set out to do was evolved for 2 reasons. One is that I took time to actually write an RL1 and became really invested in that process. So I was doing the work from the mixed methods work from the Career Development Award and attempting to use that work through some smaller pilot projects to develop and test and do some pilot work around survivorship care plans in prostate cancer. So realizing that I had proposed a lot of work to do and that I needed extra support and I had an evolving approach to that third aim. So I think from the grants perspective, something that is feasible and that evolves but isn't contingent on each of the aims is probably a good approach. I think the part of the impact and significance of the content that I wrote dealt with, one of the most common cancers among men and overall, and the gap in survivorship care. So I think the content and potential for impact matters, and then with the progression of the aims as I kind of discussed there.
Great. Thanks for that, Ted. So we wanted to shift into talking a little bit, and we've already heard a few nice comments about the grant writing process, but wondered if each of you could relate to the folks listening in what sort of key challenges you found in the writing process for these ultimately successful grants that might be helpful for others to learn from. Maybe we can start with Becca and then Mega and then Ted.
Sure. Key challenges. There could be so many. So I think that one key challenge for me was starting, and this actually goes back to the question earlier around aims. Like really, for the first big grant that I was going to be writing, how was I going to get rolling and really stay on target? I actually started with the grant application writers workbook as the structure, and I'm sure Sarah can link to that, to really get myself rolling in terms of how everything was supposed to be structured, because grant writing was a new process for me. I'd helped people write other grants, but I'd never been the one leading it myself. So having that structure to get myself just rolling was really, really important. And then the next challenge to overcome came from some advice I got from my mentor that said, okay, I can tell you used this grant application writer's workbook because it sounds just like they tell you to write it. And now you have to put it in your own voice. And so starting with that structure, but then giving myself enough time and space to make the grant flow with my own tone, my own language, getting less rigid. So really having that phased approach to really jump into the writing process was really important to get me started. So I'll start with that.
I agree. Getting started is the hardest part. And for me, it's, I think, like, when is the inspiration going to hit? When am I going to know what the most important question is? You know, and you can't really fake that. I've tried to write grants before where I wasn't really that invested in either the intervention or the research question, and those are hard grants to write. I had a really great conversation, probably about 5 years ago, with someone in the Office of Behavioral and Social Science Research, and he encouraged me to take a step back and think about what the big questions were in my field. So he said, talk to the scholars of mass incarceration. What are they studying? What are they interested in? And that was a really great exercise to just sort of take a step back from the work and, you know, take a macro look at, well, what are the big problems in the field? And then just like having the space, clearing the cobwebs in my brain to sort of think about, all right, well, how do these larger questions translate down to the work that I'm doing, to the problems that I'm facing, to the need in the population? So yeah, I think the inspiration is probably the hardest part.
Great. Ted?
So I think getting started was important, and so I agree with Becca and Mega in terms of getting into that flow. And I think one thing that was a bit challenging, not necessarily challenging, but just time consuming and really enriching, I find, is really getting into the weeds of where are the gaps in the field. And so you do that through regular meetings with your mentor, and then reading the papers that are coming out, reading Dr. Proctor's 10 key ingredients for an implementation grant, snowball sampling the references to understand where the sources of kind of what we know now are coming from. So we aren't and many times when you're writing the paper, you're referencing a paper that references a paper. And so really going down that rabbit hole to really understand the context for, why or where did audit and feedback come from? How has it been used? And, seeing the field emerge so that you can kind of come out on the more enlightened side and kind of think about where the gaps are, at least as how you see them, and then pitch that to your mentorship team. So that was, I think, one of the harder things to do, because it's such a broad field, and making sure that you're progressing in kind of what you're investigating.
Great, thanks to all of you for that, and thanks to those the questions that are coming in. We'll start to get to. Was curious because I think there's variable understanding about how NIH staff can be helpful through the process. If each of you might briefly comment about where you found the point at which you wanted to reach out and the kind of conversations that you felt were beneficial to have with NIH staff, anything that others might learn from your experience with these contexts. Maybe we can start with Megan, then Ted, and then Becca.
So NCI staff have been incredibly helpful. And I think I probably had a mentor at some point and say, oh yeah, be sure to talk to your program officer. And I didn't really know what I was going to get out of that. But, you know, as I said, the program officer is almost the first person who I bring a specific aims page to. Once a grant gets reviewed and I get the pink sheets or, you know, the comments, the first thing I do is make a phone appointment with my program officer to go through those comments. And I always do exactly what the program officers say, because they have insight into the review process. They're often there, if not physically in the room, they're on the phone. They're obviously in touch with the portfolio at NCI and what is missing, what is sort of on the horizon. And they're just like, you know, all my program officers are experts in their fields and just have a lot of insight into, you know, what's an interesting question, what's cutting edge, what gaps are in my own thinking about a problem. I've also found that everyone is 1 or 2 emails away. I've always gotten a chance to get on the phone with my NCI program officers, and that's been really helpful. I encourage all of my mentees to reach out, and it's not the same across institutes, but there is something really unique about NCI and its program officers.
Great, thanks. Ted?
Yeah, I didn't speak with the folks about the grant at NCI, but I use the website. I, you know, get the newsletter and really try to, you know, see prior presentations and things that are available on the web to really learn about the NCI and NIH's take on D&I research. Also use the VA cyber seminars to see prior presentations from leaders and folks out there doing the work of implementation. So those were the driving resources, in addition to getting the table of contents for implementation science and trying to stay current on that evolving literature.
So like Mega, I also sent my aims in quite early to get a read from NCI program staff. I was really kind of shocked by the level of engagement and feedback that I got in a very short period of time early on that really helped me craft the rest of the proposal. The other thing that I did is because I'm in the cancer prevention space, and nutrition and physical activity with children seemed really far away from cancer to me when I was crafting these aims. And so I knew I wanted to go to the D&I study section, but I wasn't quite sure where this grant would fit best. And it was really helpful to have conversations with the program officers at NCI to say, so we do fund prevention research at, you know, in this space. It does align with our portfolio, and have that reassurance that it is a good fit, even though it didn't feel like it would be necessarily. I also talked to folks at NICHD. You know, they focus more on children. It felt like a better fit, but they're not as engaged in the D&I space. To try to get a sense of, they had just joined the study section, I believe, the year before I submitted, you know, what they were looking at. And what I learned from at least my first conversation was, I think they hadn't really engaged too much in figuring out what they would want to fund in that space. So I was reassured that NCI was the place I should send this, and by talking to program staff, I really learned a lot about the perspectives of the different institutes that could be the funder.
To make a quick plug, so we are updating the chat in the right-hand side of your screen with relevant links and things that have been mentioned. I know you are attending this webinar, and we appreciate your attendance, but the VA HSR&D webinar series, they call them cyber seminars, release monthly content that are really wonderful, and so I'd suggest signing up for that newsletter as well to sort of see their spate of offerings if you are looking for more webinar meetings.
Cool. Yes, there's a treasure trove of them. Awesome. So we're shifting a little bit now to hear a little bit about your experience in having these grants reviewed. And so wondered if each of you could share your experience in that process, what you felt like with the grants that you submitted were the strengths and weaknesses that were identified by reviewers. And there was a question about the degree to, or whether all of the grants that you've had experience with were reviewed by the D&I study section versus other study sections. So maybe as you're going along, just maybe reference which of the study sections a particular grant was reviewed in, and maybe we can start with Ted and then move to Becca and Mega.
Sure. So mine was reviewed in DIRH, and I think some of the strengths that, and this is thanks to, again, mentorship and a lot of review from folks who've written grants and kind of supported me, was to really tie in the conceptual framework meaningfully throughout the structure and aims of the grant, where you're not just putting in a framework or a model or a theory to just have it in there, but to really use it and use it throughout, so that, you know, at the end of the project or proposal, it can, you know, it would be demonstrated throughout the work that that you actually have contributed to the literature of that. And mine will be the theoretical domains framework. The other aspect, I mean, there was some concerns about smaller concerns about you know, actually the target population size and some of the piloting efforts we were going to do, but those were fairly minor. I think they felt like the challenges that we were going to face were articulated, so didn't try to not bring them up, but we wrote clearly about kind of the different things we thought we would face in operationalizing the grant and how we were going to address those. And then a fairly rigorous demonstration of what the pilot, what we were going to do during the pilot work to plan for broader implementation and dissemination and trialing of the different strategies. So those were some of the things that were highlighted.
Great, thanks.
So look, it was an interesting exercise for me to kind of look back at this. So some of the things upon my first submission, this was submitted to the D&I study section, as I said before, and I haven't submitted to any other study sections, was a first kind of concern with the feasibility of the study design that we proposed. So we proposed a 3-arm RCT, and there were thoughts around maybe doing a 2-arm or quality improvement design. And that was an area where we really wanted to be able to stick with the 3-arm RCT because we wanted more of a hybrid approach, even though actually when I wrote this, I wasn't using that language, but that's what we were doing, where we really wanted to have more evidence for effectiveness and implementation outcome data. So we were able to quite easily address that concern and really explain in more detail why we wanted to stick with that part of our design. So that's an area where there was concern, but we kind of didn't change, but explained, you know, our decisions. There was limited space dedicated to the details around our qualitative part of the grant, and that's really the area where, upon revision, I think there was a lot of strength added in. We added a lot more detail about the analysis plan, but also we expanded the scope of the qualitative work. So we increased the number of interviews we were going to do. And we also kind of were told that there was limited detail on the content of the intervention and how it was linked to theory. I think we did a good job with the D&I framework, but also there was theory behind the intervention itself, and so being able to dedicate more space to that. So I was really pleased that the type of feedback I was given in review really made it a stronger proposal and helped me think through certain parts of the study and communicate them better. A lot of the things had been in my head but not on the paper, and were pretty easy to explain. In other places, the grant just got better by going through review. I don't know if we can always say that, but it really was a great experience of improving the grant from my perspective.
Great, thanks. Megha?
So I think it's been really helpful to me to sit on a study section. So I would say to the audience, you know, if you're not a regular member, to volunteer to serve as an ad hoc reviewer, apply to the early career reviewer program, or even ask a senior colleague for an introduction to your SRO. It's just really illuminating to see what that review process is like. And there's no question I've become a better grant writer. In fact, I've found myself when I write grants, I go to the review criteria in the program announcement and write to those criteria. So I'll just say that. But in terms of the nitty gritty, I mean, I think I was always taught that when it comes to manuscript or grant review, to just do everything the reviewers ask. I think, one, it probably improves the application. And two, it also, I think, shows a little bit of grace that, you know, you're saying, yes, thank you so much for these suggestions. It's possible that you're going to see this again. So to just do what reviewers ask. There is this question, though, of should you do more than what reviewers ask, or should you change the application drastically beyond what the reviewers have asked? And this is something that I and my mentees sort of go back and forth on. I will say, in my personal experience, sticking to what the reviewers ask for has paid off. Changing an application entirely when it's not called for, that strategy has not really worked well for me. But, I mean, I think it is case specific. The third thing I'll say is definitely talk to your program officer when you get the comments back. Those program officers, mine anyway, are like magic. I don't know if it's because they were there on the phone or if they are just really good at reading between the lines, but they have been able to tell me, Sylvia Cho, for example, has worked with me for a number of years, you know, exactly what a comment means, and so that I can better address that comment.
Great, thanks so much for those. And in light of the fact that we've got a number of different questions that I want to make sure we get to, we're kind of moving into our rapid response round. So we had a couple of different questions around collaboration, and maybe for anyone of you who wants to chime in, and if you don't feel like you have a specific example to relate, then that's fine too. So one question was whether any of you have included a possible competitor as a collaborator on a grant, and whether there had been any concern about somebody you know, who you wanted to join you, but potentially using specific ideas and thinking about doing their own work, you know, so places in which those collaborations haven't worked out in the way that you hoped they would. And that relates to another question that was asked. So anyone have any not as positive collaboration stories or any concerns or ways that you navigated collaborations that didn't work as you thought they might?
Megha here. So I guess I've had collaborators that have done nothing, which is fine. I'm sort of non-confrontational. I mean, usually in this budget, there's not a lot of room to put a lot of effort for these kinds of people. So I usually just leave them on there and, you know, it is what it is. My field is pretty friendly, so I don't really have any competitors, but as I've become more senior, I've had the opportunity, and it's been an incredible opportunity, to work with people who are doing similar work. And so now, you know, we're all friends and collaborators, and it's super fun. I also think, and, you know, maybe I have a different experience because I'm a social scientist, that there's room for everybody in this game. No one other investigator has my exact expertise or experience in the field. And so in my small research world, there isn't a true competitor. And I think that perspective has been helpful.
Any other things to share?
I would echo Megha's comments in that, so one, I've collaborated with other folks who've gone through MT Dirk program, other urologists who, are familiar with the clinical content as well as the scientific expertise. Haven't had issues with collaborators, and I would say that doing great work in a certain area and trying to do your best, I agree with Mega in that no one really has the skill set that you have, and I think the long game will pay off. At least that's how I approach it, and just trying to do the right thing, being collaborative, and maybe there are some less than great experiences that we might be in for, but in general, I find most folks collaborative, and people vote with their feet and their products.
Gotcha. Another question, also in the vein of collaborators, and it was asking, what role do postdocs have in your projects, and how can their experience be enhanced, or how can we overall as a field improve the transition of postdocs into career positions? So whether it's your own experience as postdocs or in running these projects, how you've been able to use postdocs. Anyone want to jump in?
So I have a large team that's made up of about 3 senior people, including myself, 3 junior faculty postdoc types, and then a bunch of master's level people and medical students. And so we have one great strategy, which is that everyone takes responsibility for being the first author on a paper, and we sort of, rotate that responsibility so that way everyone is getting on multiple papers. And that has been really important for the junior faculty to help them build a track record of publications, but it's also great for the rest of the team because we're on papers together. So that's one thing. I mean, I think I realize as a mentor that postdocs are there not to help you do your work, but to advance their own careers and get started. So I try to get my postdocs to publish as much as possible. I'm always trying to connect people to the right program officer, to the right mentor, to figure out what the best mechanism is for that next step. So a couple of my mentees have, Ks that are out or on their second K submission, or have been successful, and just sort of always looking for opportunities, whether they're small pilot projects or larger career development awards, to get those out there. But it is a lot of hands-on work. To the extent that I'm not, it's hard for me to do my own work sometimes.
Any other thoughts on that one? So maybe a jumping off point from Mega, from your comment. There was a question just about balance. And I'll make it a little bit more general as to how, given all of the different responsibilities you all have, some with clinical responsibilities, some with a whole range of community and other responsibilities, any advice you have on how you sort of manage the work on these different grants with the other responsibilities that you have?
This is Becca. I can start with balance. This is something I have thought about a lot. I think balance is something that we can try to work towards, but I think it's always changing. What balance means, and it might be different from month to month. Especially with this first grant that I was PI on, it was really important to me that I had the support of my mentors and a really strong research team of research assistants and analysts to help me prioritize this grant. It was a 2-year R21 as my top priority for that full 2 years. I think that was really important for making sure that all the aims were done. I was able to put more effort on it than most people are able to, and I think that that's a really good practice if you're able to early in your career, to make sure that first grant is very strong and successful. Since then, I've really been thinking about, what's the way to strike balance now that I'm going to think about other grants that I want to be PI on or co-PI on. I've taken on a lot more teaching responsibilities. So now balance looks different, and it's a lot more co-I work and a lot more teaching. But I would say that balance being heaviest on getting this first grant solid and done correctly and in a good journal, all of that was really important. So I think balance changes with where you are in your career, and thinking of it that way rather than just one way, I think is a helpful frame.
Great, thanks. Anyone else want to chime in?
Sure. I will just echo Becca's comments with respect to the team, having a strong project manager and experienced research assistants and regular meetings can help make sure that all the aspects of the project are moving forward in a timely manner and that all the work is getting done. I think the integration of work and life is a constantly evolving process. And one thing I've fortunate is that I've been able to integrate the clinical work somewhat with the research, and always using that clinical work to inform the real world care delivery that I'm trying to study and trying to, make it, even more interesting by taking a step back and understanding kind of the context that I'm living and working in. So it's a lot of hard work, and sometimes it takes longer than you think it's going to. So it's definitely a moving target and something you just continue to work at.
Sure. Megha, anything to add?
I take all of my vacation days.
Okay, that works. Quick question, actually, that came up, which I think was related to something that Becca had said. I think you had talked earlier on about how there was a sort of grant writing workbook that had been helpful for you. So I don't know if there's someone had asked whether that was whether there was a specific reference that you found to be helpful.
Yes, there is a specific reference, and I will make sure I send it to Sarah so she can get it in the notes. I'll do that right now.
That would be wonderful, Becca. And sort of to that end, as we wrap up, I would, as David mentioned, note that our sample grants are provided to us on a volunteer basis, and they take a lot of effort on behalf of Wynn Norton on staff here. And so this resource that is such a highly trafficked and well-used opportunity is really sort of at the grace of these wonderful individuals who are giving us their intellectual property to share with all of you, and for Wynn's time in sort of making these things available. So one, huge recognition there in making those things available, and also to say that Gila Netta on our team is the primary point of contact for the DIRH PAR. Her contact information is available on our website, as are a bevy of other resources. So, we link to NIH Office of Extramural Research sample aims pages, how to write a bio sketch at various levels. There is an extramural research podcast that is well loved and is about 10 years into its run. And so many of those resources are on our website under the funding page. I would encourage you all to go visit them. And with that, I'm going to thank Megha, Ted, Becca, and David for their time today. Your feedback is important to us. We encourage you to complete our online evaluation. A link to the survey will open a new window once this session has concluded. And an archive of today's session will be made available shortly on our website. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope that you tune in to our November 14th session featuring former DIRH study section chairs. Thank you so much. You may disconnect at this time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.